Hello, my name is Cecil Walker.
And I am Adam Froer.
And this is Possibilities. Adam, today we are chatting about attention, how to make the most of it, maybe even what to do with it when you do have a lot of it. So I guess to kick us off, maybe a first good place to start is, what do we mean by attention, and why is it maybe a good thing to use it well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think one of the reasons that I would say, well, I guess I should answer the first question and then answer the second question. The first question is, what is attention? And I would say attention is what we put meaningful focus toward. So I think we'll make a little bit of a distinction as we go around just simply focusing on something, but having attention meaning putting focus, but it's meaningful focus. So I think then the second part of your question is, so why is that important? Why should we focus on it? I think we hear so much today of people who struggle with inattention, people who have been diagnosed with ADHD, which makes attention and focus difficult. I think we live in an era of huge amounts of distraction, right? We oftentimes think of people who are good multitaskers, who are trying to do more than one thing at a time, but really all of the research says you can't actually focus on more than one thing at a time. Your attention really just shifts really quickly back and forth, and therefore you don't, again, this gets to that place of meaning, you don't meaningfully put your attention on one thing or the other, you're just kind of flitting back and forth. And so I think this idea of attention is really important because there's so many competing things, ideas, concepts, activities that are vying for our focus. That when we meaningfully can dedicate our focus to something, that's actually going to give us a greater return on our investment, I would say.
Yeah, I like how you describe that, because it clarifies, I think, what can be a common misconception about attention is that people who might think of themselves as quintessentially bad at focusing have maybe a deficit of attention. They don't have enough of it. But I think what I hear and what you're describing and what I know to be true in a lot of different cases is it's not just that you don't have the capacity for it. It's that it's being spent in ways that aren't in line with how you want it to be spent. It's not going towards the things that you want it to go towards. It's not picking up on what actually is really crucial in a given moment. It's not doing what would be most helpful for it to do at certain times. So it's not that you're incapable of accomplishing a said thing, of using your attention in a certain way. It's just that it hasn't been used that way.
Yeah, I think embedded in what you're saying, and I think one of the things I guess that might be useful is to integrate another word in there, which is intentional, right? Of purposefully giving your attention to something instead of it just letting it haphazardly, like, this is what I'm focusing on at the moment. And I think one of the things that's really valuable about kind of the incorporation of attention and intention is that obviously those two words have a large overlap in letters. And if you look at kind of the root of those words of tension, we have an association with tension of it's stressful, or it's difficult, it's hard, there's stress involved in that. But if you look at the meaning of that root of tension, it really means simply to purposefully extend, to stretch, to which I think is important because it implies this is going to take effort. This is not just something that haphazardly happens. This is something that you have to be purposeful about doing. I have to, not only do I have to choose where my focus is going to go, but I have to then exert effort to maintain my focus on that particular thing. And if you know in advance, right, that this idea of tension, this extending my focus, is going to take a little bit of effort, then instead of it becoming a personality flaw or a character weakness, it becomes something that I could practice, that I could deliberately get better at.
Right.
Which I think then there's embedded in that a lot of hope to say, I could get better at having attention.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when we think of other abilities like like strength or something, no one would count themselves out and say, "I'm just not the kind of person who can lift this heavy thing." That sounds kind of absurd. It makes much more sense to say, "Well, I haven't worked out much lately. I haven't done the effort that it takes, done the hard work that it takes to get to be strong enough to easily lift these kinds of things." I think it's the exact same thing with attention. Is I haven't been intentional enough in exercising this type of thing to be able to be to accomplish the kind of task that someone with a really full and attentive kind of focus could be able to accomplish.
Yeah, so I guess that begs the question a bit. If it's like an exercise that I could practice, that I could get better at, how do I do that? How do I practice attention?
Well, I think because attention is a constant feature of our minds, I think there's probably infinite ways you could practice it. What's really, really fascinating is I was reading not too long ago, there were studies about, and you'll be happy to hear this because I see the way that you raise your children, and it says there are studies that have shown that parents who remind their children of certain habits, those children grow up to have really good attentive skills in school. Like they are better at reading comprehension, they're better at remembering information that they pick up in school, they're better at their study and their diligence in school. Somehow it transfers over. And it's things that their parents are reminding them about that seem irrelevant to that. They'll remind them, make sure you sit up straight, make sure you say please and thank you, make sure you wipe your mouth when there's things on your face, or just little things that they need to be attentive to. And what it does is exactly like you just described, it stretches their attention a bit. The effort that they have to take to do those little things grows that muscle inside of them, and then they can easily use that for this stuff in school, this stuff related to their academics. And so if that's a great example of how they can see how being attentive in these little ways over here can grow your attention in these really crucial ways over here, I think that shows us that there's probably lots of different ways we could practice that. I've even seen some people say, like, if you're a dominant hand, you usually do everything with. If you did stuff with your non-dominant hand, that's the same kind of thing of trying to be intentional in a practiced kind of way. I think that sounds kind of, a bit over the top or strange to do, but the idea, I think, is what we want to go for. And so if someone is finding themselves wanting to grow their attention, wanting to use their attention in a more meaningful way, all you have to do is pick a thing and say, I want to pay attention to that. I'm going to try to keep myself in tune with that. And even if my mind wanders, even if it does things I don't want it to do, or I forget that this is the thing I'm supposed to pay attention to, you just bring it right back to that. It could be something you check in with every day. Maybe you want to try to practice gratitude. I want to make sure every single day I have at least 5 minutes where I practice gratitude. And that kind of reminds you to bring your attention to, here's what I'm grateful for. I think that has benefits beyond just attention, but I think that's one of the benefits. So it could be anything like that. You just say, I want to make sure I put my attention on this thing for this amount of time. And if you forget, you have to catch yourself and bring yourself back. And that's the rep, right? That's the exercise. That's how you stretch your attention, by just making it say, I want it to go this way, and I know it's going to try to do all these different things, but I have to keep reminding it. I have to be that parent that kind of, I remember once you said that, the best parents are the ones who nag their kids the most. And I think it's the same kind of idea. If you nag your attention to go the way that you want it to go, it'll have that same kind of outcome as your children will be better students.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I had a different conversation that you and I had come back to my mind. And it kind of highlights this idea of each of us might have a different way to practice attention. And we were talking about this concept of people who are visualizers or versus people who are not visualizers. And we discovered that Cecil is very much a person who, as he goes through life, he kind of visualizes, he sees in his mind's eye, as conversations develop, he kind of imagines a picture that goes along with that. And I am very much not that kind of a person. So I guess if we use that term, like you're a high visualizer and I'm a low visualizer. And so as we were having that conversation, we were kind of fascinated by how can you process and learn information in that way, and I process and learn information in I guess I would say in a very linguistic way. Language is what's going through my head instead of images, and we talked about how when we're creating a memory, you said I just go back through the image that I created as the conversation was happening, and I can start anywhere in that image, and then the rest of the image kind of just falls into place. And I said that is not how I remember things at all. And in some sense, I make a deliberate decision. This is something worth remembering. I'm going and I create a memory. I create a memory about that particular thing. And as we were going through that process, as you were talking, I thought, so the way that you would dedicate energy and attention might be in a very visual way. You might create images to go along with your attention, or as you're studying something, images might come with it. For me, that's not how I would dedicate attention to something. I would do it in a very logical, linguistic way. And so we would use our various skills and strengths to dedicate attention to it. The way you might practice might be very different than the way I practice, but we both can strengthen a skill that we already have.
Yeah, I like that tactic of using the way that you organically interact with the world around you, using that to your advantage in terms of trying to hone your attentive abilities. Because I do think that matters quite a lot. Obviously, if we're processing the world in a very different way, you can't say you got to use my lens for how to sharpen your way of looking at things. Still blows my mind that you're able to do it without images, but accepting that that's the way that some people do, and maybe there are even alternative ways. Maybe there are ways outside of these two that people process the world. But going through that particular perspective and saying, well, in this world, this way of looking at things, how can I begin to strengthen this muscle that we started to talk about earlier? And it's kind of a very metacognitive thing to think about, to imagine outside of my own way of thinking. But I kind of imagine that it would matter. It would make a difference if you kind of leaned towards your own way of thinking about things.
Yeah, and I think that goes kind of bringing it back full circle. I think that brings it back to this place of intentionality.
Absolutely.
Right? That for me, if I'm going to practice attention, I'm going to be intentional about that. That I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to create a specific place. I'm going to create a specific scenario. That's going to help me. And in psychology, they actually call that state conditioned learning, right? And when you create state conditioned learning, when you learn something in a particular environment, if you go back into that environment, you're much more likely to be able to recall that information. And so for me, that is a really important, valuable piece of attention, is setting a stage around me. Maybe that is for you or it isn't, but being intentional about how to dedicate attention might be different for each of us, but nonetheless, each of us will have to be purposeful about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're kind of getting into what I was going to ask you next. I'm very interested what you might say about this. As you start to do that, as we start to be more intentional, as people might start to say, well, here's what I want to use my attention for. Here's how I want to be purposeful in what I'm kind of shining this internal light on. How do we know it's getting better? What shows us that our attention is becoming more intentional or being used more efficiently, being used better than it was before?
So I think that would depend a little bit on a couple of things. I think one, if we're getting better at either eliminating distraction or avoiding the distractions that we cannot eliminate, right? So I think, like I mentioned before, we all have phones at this point, and they either vibrate or they make a noise. And the creators of those phones have been very intentional about capturing your attention, right? They have done studies to say which noises, which sequence of sound, which pitches, what's going to grab your attention. So they know that attention is a commodity, and they have purposefully said, how do we get a share of your attention? And so one thing that can happen is if we intentionally say, I will silence my phone, or I will distance my phone, or I will whatever, the more time we can say, instead of giving that portion of my attention away, I'm going to hold on to it. So I think one indicator is sheer time and effort that goes into managing it. I think another is, and again, it depends on the task that you're trying to accomplish, but we all have these times where we engage in activities that we really love, right? And when you engage in an activity that you really love, you find yourself getting sucked in. And all of a sudden, time becomes irrelevant.
Yeah.
You could do that thing for 5 minutes, or you could do that thing for 5 hours, and you would never lose interest in that thing. And so I think one of the things that might be an indicator of I'm getting better at this focus is, am I spending time doing things that are really meaningful to me? Am I setting parameters around, this is time that I get to really delve into what I enjoy? Again, kind of one of those psychological components is you enter into this flow state, right? Where you stop paying attention to the tiny little individual nuances of what's happening, and you just become so engaged in this that it completely captures your attention. You couldn't possibly think of something else because this thing is so engaging to you. And I think when we know I think this is one of the important pieces, is when we know ourselves well enough to know, this is what feeds me, this is what I love, this is, then we can decide, and again, I think this is where it comes back to this meaningfulness. We can say, I'm going to dedicate time, energy, focus, attention to this thing because it fulfills me. So I think part of how we know that this is happening is when we know ourselves well enough that we know where to dedicate our meaningful attention.
Yeah, you highlighted so many really brilliant things, I think, in there. One, I think you even further defined attention for us in what you were just describing. You used the word commodity, and it very much is that. I mean, I think we would be missing out on something here if we don't kind of highlight how valuable your attention is. No matter what you're using it for, it is a valuable thing. So much so that there are people you don't know, have never met, who are planning and strategizing and spending lots of money trying to get your attention, trying to, I don't want to use the word manipulate, but grab it and use it for whatever they want to use it for. Ads and commercials cost billions of dollars. Those little spots on Facebook and on TikTok and on YouTube, all those things cost a lot of money. And teams of people work to use that in just the right way and get it into just the right spot and make you see it in a certain kind of a way. And so all of that should let you know that your attention is this really, really valuable resource. And because it's valuable, when I stay aware of that, it makes me think, well, I want to use it really, really carefully, right? If I was holding a handful of diamonds or I just had a bucket full of money, I'm not just going to go pouring that anywhere. I'm not just going to throw that around. I'm going to be careful with what I do with that. So that's one thing that was really, really, I think, important that you kind of showed us in what you were just describing. But the other thing, I think, even further, once you realize how valuable your attention is, when you start to be really intentive about how you're using it, when there's a lot of purpose in what you're doing with it, I think what you start to see is the presence of choice in how you're using it. It's not being taken from you. It's not wandering off on its own. It's not automatically just doing what it does. You're putting choice into how you use your attention. I think that sounds so simple, but I think that is a hallmark of when I'm using my attention for what I want to be using it for. When I'm using it well, it's I chose to put my attention into this thing. I think a lot of us these days are probably really careful about, iPhones will show you, the hours that you spent on your. I hate that update every week. Every now and then I had a good week where I know I didn't scroll through Facebook or spend too much time on YouTube for too long or whatever. But most weeks I kind of hate seeing that little report. And I think that has kind of given a lot of us the awareness of sometimes I get lost in my phone. Sometimes I'm spending time not even really choosing to. All these minutes will just burn by. For some people, even hours will just burn by. And it doesn't really felt like I chose to give it that time. But the opposite is true when you're being more purposeful, you're being more intentional. You can feel like even if I spent a lot of time on this thing, I chose to give my attention to that. I chose to make this the center of what I'm paying attention to right now.
If so much of it is a choice, you're using this commodity, however it is you choose to, what response would you give to some people who say, but my inattention isn't something that I can control. Maybe it is something genetic, or maybe there is a chemical imbalance in there, or maybe, for whatever reason, somebody would say, but I don't have complete agency over that. What would your response be to that?
I tend not to accept any type of black and white description of something like that. So this isn't specific to this group of people. This is how I think about people in general. Like I said earlier, you can't really say, I'm just not the kind of person who could lift that heavy object. Maybe you feel incapable of that. Maybe it would be really, really hard. Maybe it would take a lot of effort. Sure. But you can't statically remain the kind of person incapable of doing that thing. I think what you're really saying is that there might be a lot of steps in the way before I can see myself accomplishing that task, which, if you really want to accomplish that task, is irrelevant. It doesn't matter how many steps there are. So I think the real critical thing to talk about at that point is, what will it take? Not I can't. I just am not the kind of person who can do that. In some sense, we were just talking about social media. We're all predisposed to lose our attention to some of these things. TV can burn up all of our attention. All these things, the dings and the bells and the notifications, all of this takes our attention away very easily. We're all predisposed to that. But that doesn't mean that we can't circumnavigate that somehow, or we can't build up, whatever it takes to be able to start to use our attention in a more purposeful way. And so what I would say then, maybe one of those first few steps is to begin to say, what do you want to use your attention for? What do you want to be, if you had the kind of attention that you're saying might be really hard to get, what would you spend it on in the first place? Where would you put this really valuable commodity if you had more of it?
Yeah, I think you're raising a really important point, because oftentimes we as clinicians, we encounter parents especially who will bring in their adolescents or something, and they'll say, look, my kid does not have attention. He is not paying attention in school, or she's completely at a loss in these areas. And inevitably, if you start talking to them,
That's true.
and you talk to the kid and you say, what are you really good at? What's the number one answer you hear to that question?
These days, the most common answer is video games.
Video games. So that in and of itself is the highlight of what you're talking about, right? They're saying, my kid is not giving attention to school or to music practice or to whatever it is, but they have endless attention to give to a video game. And so I think that's the thing that I would come back to is it's still a commodity. We still have control over, am I going to give it to this, or am I going to work hard enough to give it to something else? And I think that you're highlighting something really important. I think there are people who would say, you know, I have a lot of people I've talked to would say, like, I have adult ADHD. And one of the things that they will say then is, so it makes it really hard to focus or concentrate at work. And I get fidgety and I whatever, right? If you know those things about yourselves, again, I would say you then have the autonomy to say, okay, if I know I get fidgety at work, these are things that I can do to manage that. But the other thing I would say is, oftentimes when we talk like that, our focus is hyper-focused on one particular thing. I can't focus at work. And one of the things I would say is if you take a step back and you pay attention to the overall pattern, you can look at, does my diet impact that? Do my sleep habits impact that? Does my scrolling on Instagram until 3 o'clock in the morning impact that, right? So am I saying, no, adult ADHD or even regular kid ADHD doesn't exist? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is what you're saying, I hear you saying is, you can be purposeful and intentional about controlling things to minimize the impact of those things. And you say, I'm the kind of person that needs to dedicate more regular sleep so that I have more attention to give during the day or something like that.
Yeah, I feel like if that's the singular only thing that people take away from this, that alone would make a difference for a lot of people. It's not that you are without this thing entirely, or you're just somehow detached from having any type of functioning attention. Your attention is somewhere. It's going to something. You probably could name a thing that somehow miraculously sustains your attention for long periods of time, even if that's a thing that you might be ashamed to say you're spending so much time on.
Netflix seems to be getting a lot of attention these days.
Exactly. I saw somewhere that one of the executives at Netflix said that their main competition is sleep now. They've drawn people away so well. They can keep people watching so well that the only thing getting in the way now at this point is that eventually people have to sleep. But yeah, your attention is going somewhere. And so if all you do is start to be purposeful about it and say, well, I see it's over there a lot, but I want it to be in this spot, that is going to have some cascading effect already, just to be able to say, it's over there and I want it to come here.
Yeah, beautiful. I think the only other thing that I would say in this idea is something actually that has come up in several of our possibility videos, is that really the fundamental component of this is a self-evaluation to say, what do I actually want? In solution-focused brief therapy, we oftentimes call that the desired outcome, right? We say, what do you really want from this? And in some sense, in this particular arena, it's where do I want to dedicate my attention? Once you know what you want your attention to go to, then you can start looking at what's getting in the way of it going there. And so I think that's the thing that I would say is you might need to start with the end in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you. We would love to hear kind of your thoughts and reactions to our take on attention. Let us know what you think. Send us comments. If you find it useful, if you think other people would benefit from that, please like and share it with others. But in the meantime, we hope that you spend your attention on things that are really meaningful.